Well, Australia's world first under 16 social media ban is now officially live. Platforms are legally required to stop children under 16 from holding accounts or face fines of up to $49.5 million. But already on day one, the system is being tested. Sky News reporting teenagers were able to bypass age verification within hours of the ban starting, and that includes my youngest daughter. At the same time, a former senior Facebook executive has delivered a blunt warning, claiming tech companies do not actually want this ban to work properly. I don't think that's a shock at all. Aidan McClinton is a political advisor for Aligned Council of Australia who is against the ban. He joins me now to share his reaction to day one. Aidan, welcome to McKnight Tonight.
Good evening, Rob. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm good, thank you. Good to have you here. Now, you've argued this policy is unenforceable at scale. On day one, kids are already bypassing it. Are you feeling vindicated right now?
Look, I think what we've seen here, Rob, is it took about 9 days to push this policy through the Parliament
Yeah.
after you've had some social platforms has existed for over 20 years. So what we're seeing here is a bit of a furphy, to be honest, and we're actually seeing the leadership positions in Australia with very, very few leaders in them. So to have this sort of, this fluff and bubbles of, all of a sudden we're going to protect the kids, I think that's a bit more insidious than that. And I think what we're going to do is see the unintended consequences of more children going to the dark web under the search engines such as Tor, TOR. And I think you're going to have the federal police and ASIO are going to be under-resourced for those avenues where predators and the like are going to have a field day, because what they're going to do is going to have access to more people in a very vulnerable situation. And it just hasn't been policy that's been thought through properly at all. So I think this is just the beginning of a terrible interruption, I would suggest, or intervention by the government into privacy, freedom of speech, not just for the under 16s, but then to prove yourself that you're over 16, and who to trust less than the government than to grab more and more details from you, which we've seen massive breaches, particularly in Australia in the last few years. So you've got to ask yourself what is actually behind this, because it certainly isn't all of a sudden they're going to protect their children on a couple of social media platforms.
Look, I saw Julie Imnan-Grant on the 7:30 report tonight talking to Sarah Ferguson, and there's no doubt in my mind she thinks she's doing the right thing here. And she talked about the fact that what she's seeing from social media companies is that they start off with the right intentions when they're small, but as they grow, they become more concerned about the money making and they really don't care about protecting kids. Is that a reason why we maybe should have this ban?
Look, I think the monetization absolutely comes in. It'll have an impact, and what they're making that money on is another question itself. What we've got to realise is there's over 300 social media platforms out there, so that doesn't capture all of them for a start. As you've just said earlier, the kids are much more the digital natives, as they call them. They're very savvy. They were steps years ahead of the government. So for them to then pretend that, we're looking after the youth, well, okay, well, what about the plethora of adult sites out there that children can access at fingertips? It's like you've got to start asking. This actually breeds more questions than it does answers. And whilst on the outside it might look like, we're doing a fantastic thing, you look at any over-regulated industry. Look at the tobacco industry, for example. I mean, look at here in Victoria, you've had over 150 tobacco stores that have been engulfed in flames in the last 12 months. I mean, is that good policy? Because you can get a $10 packet of cigarettes in America that might cost $45 or $50 a packet in Australia. So what we've seen historically is that when you over-regulate a market, when you disempower the parents from doing their role, which is to be good parents, then naturally when government intervenes, it more often than not is very clumsy, it's inadequate. It even admits itself that it will not be enforced. So when you ask yourself, if it's not going to be enforced, why is it being imposed in the first place? As I said, this breeds a lot
Yeah,
more
the way
questions
this
than
has been
answers.
put together with the tech companies, there wasn't really a lot of time. But let me ask you this: your organisation has warned this ban will create more harm than it prevents. I agree with you about we should make the whole internet safer. When someone's attacking you on X or Instagram, you should be able to report and have things done. But so often they say it doesn't violate our community guidelines. But why do you think this ban will create more harm than it prevents?
Well, what you're doing is basically you're taking, the soft drink off the children, and they can access the soft drink anyway. So you don't know what type of soft drink they're drinking, where they're drinking it, and who's giving it to them. So to all of a sudden to whitewash and think that these digital natives who, before they were even born, there were social media platforms, and to think to highlight an isolated marketplace and say, we're doing the right thing by the children. Well, hang on, really? Because look at the unintended consequences. Because I can guarantee you, the federal police, particularly ASIO, who are already under resourced to deal with these matters on a global scale, yet alone Australia, they're going to see that the underworld or the dark web, where obviously that is a breeding ground for predators to be able to prey on those vulnerable children, that will dramatically increase. Now, if it's already hard to monitor and engage now, can you imagine when that happens exponentially? But more to that, I think we've actually, we've forgotten that we should be empowering parents, educating children and the parents. I've spoken to police myself, who I know in their line of work, who has said this is going to be fraught with danger. And of course, they can't speak up because they're not going to bite the hand that feeds. So we've seen policy on the run. It is flawed, and I believe that within 12 to 18 months, there'll be a parliamentary inquiry to the unintended consequences. And I think this is what happens when you get people who feel good on the outside. Oh, we're doing so well, so well. Well, what about your 100 pieces of legislation that are undermining children from growing up and being healthy? And, to overregulate them and disempower the parent, unfortunately, it'll be the good parents and the good children that gets captured in policy like this. And people who want to circumvent the policy, as we've seen, it's already happened. I haven't seen too many kids that are worried about this. So I would be more concerned about the information gathering by the government to prove that you are over 16. And to me,
they keep promising that's not going to happen, but I'm not sure that I believe it. And my daughter, my youngest daughter, I asked her tonight, how is she getting around it? She did facial recognition on Snapchat, and it wasn't a problem. TikTok, it turns out she put in a false age ages ago because she wanted to use it before she was 13.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
She has it. And that was an honest conversation we had, But look,
Absolutely.
Last week we had a special edition of McKnight Tonight looking at the social media ban. And one of the panelists was Emma Mason. Now, you might know her. Her 15-year-old daughter, Tilly, died by suicide after being bullied online. She is a big supporter of this legislation. I want to play you a clip of what she told me last week in regards to the effects of taking kids off social media. Have a look.
Social media is responsible for significant online harm and for harm to our children. I recognise that there are parts of social media that gives the illusion of connection, but I'm not sure I'm convinced of actual connection. And when people say that to me and they say, well, what about the marginalised, and what about those that are LGBTQI, or what about the neurodiverse? Well, I'm going to say Tilly was all of those things, and she was destroyed as a result of connection.
Aidan, that's a mum with a lived experience. What do you think about those comments?
Look, my heart goes out to her in the suffering that family has obviously gone through and still going through. Unfortunately, I think this is symptomatic of a much, much bigger picture. It's how we raise our children, how we interrelate to them. It's what we've seen on even mainstream access to shows and even Netflix and Foxtel. I mean, where do you actually draw the line? I'm not saying that social media didn't play a significant role in the tragedy that occurred, but what we're saying here is we're casting a net out that cannot catch the fish that the government say they are after. So to me, it's a bit like the working with children's check. It's a false sense of security. It's like, I've got a working with children check, therefore I'm innocent. Well, hang on. It was a self-imposed questionnaire of whether or not you're a predator. So of course you're going to give the right answers to get that childcare children's check, and what with another level of safety. And unfortunately, the government are going to put up this very false sense of security to parents, which will actually disconnect them from what their children are doing even further, thinking that all of a sudden this media ban is going to solve all the problems. In fact, it's going to create a lot more problems. It's going to be driven underground. There's going to be a further disconnect between parents and children. What we should be focusing on is educating children and parents, being open and honest about them, putting in mechanisms in place to prevent things like that. But you're going to get the bullying in the playground, online, through an email. I mean, there are so many avenues now in which bullying occurs. Unfortunately, social media is just one microcosm in a much bigger dynamic. So I think we've actually got to take a good hard look at humanity and look at where we've gone wrong in the last 10, 15, 20 years, rather than just say, oh, we're going to cherry pick this and that's going to solve all our woes. It's not. The unintended consequences are going to be real. They're going to be harsh. And I would not be surprised, Rob, if I'm talking with you in 12 months' time from now saying, look what it's actually created. And this is why, unfortunately, it's the people behind the scenes who've got bigger agendas, accessing information, like as you said, your daughter's facial recognition. Mate, we saw one of the biggest breaches in Australian history in Optus in 2022 of almost 10 million users with all their details. Now, can you imagine what's going to happen going forward now? And I just think that every time a government intervenes to try for your protection, I think you've got to ask a lot more questions.
Look, I don't usually do this during interviews. I usually save feedback until after the interview, but I do want to bring in some because this is a topic that really gets people going. So I'm going to bring this one in from Gareth, who says, I fully support the under 16 ban as it sends a message to society about the dangers of social media. It also teaches kids at a critical age of the importance of in-person human connection. Does social media take away in-person social connection?
Well, absolutely. I think it replaces it. It substitutes it. It can be very dangerous, but as like any form of media, you have no idea who, in most cases, it's a stranger on the other end of the line, whether it's through roadblocks or games. And there's a lot of insidious ways that some of these people prey on children. So I don't think, when you look at computer games and you might look at some of the, there have been some pretty full-on computer games that kids have been playing for the last 10 or 15 years. They've been desensitized on so many fronts. So yes, it is a good message. Oh, social media is unhealthy for you. Great. So are soft drinks. So is smoking. That's unhealthy for you too. There's a lot of things that are unhealthy for us. How we go about managing it is critical, because if we do it simplistically, as we've seen this government do, I think, as I said, you'll find unintended consequences that are going to have far bigger impacts than if we educated the parents, educated the children, protected our freedom of speech, made sure our privacy and provisions were put in place. This should have happened a long time ago. It hasn't, absolutely, but you can't just get a headline and say, oh, we've banned a couple of platforms and, some of these people have absolutely no idea how some of these platforms work. You're talking about multi-billion-dollar industries that are global. There's always another way to skin the cat, and that's exactly what we're going to see with these children do. They're a lot smarter than we give them credit for, and what we're going to do is, unfortunately, it's a bit like vaping. Vaping for a lot of young people replace smoking. So, smoking's bad, smoking. Yeah, we know that. That's great. But look what it's substituted with. And same thing's going to happen with social
But do
media.
you really think kids are going to go to the dark web? You mentioned this earlier on in the interview. I mean, the dark web, that's a whole other place. I wouldn't even know how to access it. And I know I'm 52. I know I'm old and, but I'm sort of savvy. But, I understand the idea that they might go to other platforms and other apps, but the dark web, because if they go down that path, that's really dangerous. Is that realistic to think they might do that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And if we don't assume that a lot of children will go to the dark web, that will be the biggest shortfall in our judgment for the next generation, because they will, absolutely. It's just a search engine. So all they're doing is basically operating off the radar. So they're going to do more things behind their parents' back, more things that can't be traced. They're going to be interacting with people who can't be tracked. So what we're actually doing is actually going to breed a very, very dangerous environment. It already exists, but it's going to happen on steroids now, because we've seen that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. I think the opposite reaction here, as a result of flawed government policy, there'll be a lot more children that are vulnerable, and there'll be a lot more people, parents who are disconnected from what their children are actually doing. So at the end of the day, the children are going to substitute their addiction to social media. We should be talking about how to substitute it. How can we get fit? How can we eat healthy? How can we do these fun things and interact, and how to create social groups? If the government poured a little bit of money in actually doing tangible things with real outcomes for people's mental health and well-being, that I could understand. But when you're just saying, look, we're going to take a couple of soft drinks off the shelf, meanwhile you've got 10 more aisles and you wouldn't even know who there's at the checkout in the last 3 aisles, massively, massively dangerous environment.
I want to bring in another bit of feedback, because it's really something that a lot of people, I've heard this argument a lot, and it's from Own Your Crazy. And he says, I was bullied at school because there was no internet. It didn't follow me home. That is a strong argument.
Look, I think there's an element of truth in there, but so is a memory. Like what someone said to you at school, you don't just erase instantly. I think you're going to be sitting there looking at the roof and going through it and hearing it over and over again. Don't forget, just like they can switch off from a comment that was made to them, so too can they switch off on emails, internet, etc., etc. But unfortunately, we're living in this world where everything's in 60-minute cycles now. Whether it's news, whether it's updates, whether it's friendships changing in the playground. Things are a lot more erratic. They're more spontaneous. They're more stressful. And the internet was supposed to do the exact opposite. And I think what we've seen is the World Wide Web has made things a lot more stressful for people. As you said, as the gentleman said, that he was, you're bullied online as well. But this social media ban does not all of a sudden eradicate all online communication. As I said, you've got over 300 social media platforms. You've got telephone messages. You've got text. You've got, the letterboxes. I mean, there's so many forms and facets to get in touch with people. This is just one isolated microcosm that the government, I think, has chosen as a Trojan horse to, in fact, gather more data for people to restrict freedoms of speech and to intervene on what we can and can't see. And we've seen this. We've seen this in countries that have previously had freedom. And Australians we've been very lucky for a very long time. But I think we are now entering a space in a short next 5 or 10 years where some of the freedoms will be taken completely out from underneath us, and we'll wonder where the heck that came from. And this is just one of those giant leaps towards a very dangerous environment.
Yeah, there is a danger that the government knows everything I'm searching and, there is no privacy. There was even some discussion that they might try to get rid of VPNs next, when VPNs serve a whole purpose about stopping scammers being able to trace you and not just going to other locations and bypassing geo-blocks, but there is a real benefit to VPNs. But I want to ask you one final question. This social media ban has essentially created a whole industry. There's an interesting article on Crikey, which I've just pulled up on my computer. Everyone got paid, how Whipper's pro-teen social media ban group cashed in on its success. So it seems to me there's a whole industry brewing despite the best efforts. And I did have the co-owner, I guess, for want of a better term, of 36 months on this show last week in that forum. But do we run the risk now that it becomes more than just trying to do the right thing, where these organizations are trying to cash in, so there's a benefit to them keeping this ban going?
Oh, massively. And you go, as I said before, there's every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So don't underestimate the amount of people that have windfalls out of this, how other social media platforms they will find other ways to circumvent and get there. This is a battle for the marketplace. And there is absolutely no way that anyone in their right mind can say that all of a sudden social media, I mean, what is social media? It's an exhaustive long list of that many platforms out there. Yet when you see legislation, it's a social ban for under 16s. Well, I can guarantee there's probably a handful of under 16s who are disappointed for about a day or two until their mates tell them how to circumvent it. So, the government's got to get real. They haven't taken any leadership on this issue. They've been sitting on their hands for the best part of 20 years. And to do this sort of, fairy floss statements about how all of a sudden they're protecting children, no, I don't buy it for a second. And I think we're going to see a lot more ramifications going forward. And, the Aligned Council of Australia represents almost 2 million Australians, and all the member groups that we represent, not one of them have come forward to saying it's a good thing. Now, that speaks volumes, because that's a very big percentage of organisations across Australia that are saying, nah, I smell a rat here. This is not good. It's a 9-day policy that's been pushed through. And unfortunately, the unintended consequences, I think, will far outweigh the headlines that the government will make over the next 48 hours.
Well, Aidan, I have a feeling you and I might be catching up next year to find out what's happened and see if any of your forecasts have come true. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you for your time tonight on McKnight Tonight.
Likewise. Thanks, Rob.
McKnight Tonight. McKnight Tonight.
McKnight Tonight.
I'm going to have a drink tonight.